Call the police. They do not belong here. Linda Whitmore stood behind the curtains of her living room window and watched another vehicle pull onto the quiet suburban street. The late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across neatly trimmed lawns, but all she could focus on was the growing crowd gathering 2 houses down. A black pickup truck parked beside a silver SUV. Then another sedan arrived. And another. People stepped out carrying trays covered in foil, folding chairs, coolers, and large containers of food. Laughter drifted through the warm summer air. Children raced across the grass while adults greeted one another with hugs and handshakes. The smell of charcoal and slow-cooked barbecue floated through the neighborhood. To most people it looked like a family gathering. To Linda it looked like trouble. She crossed her arms and frowned. This neighborhood used to be quiet, she muttered to herself. Across the street, the Carter family moved through their front yard with easy confidence. James Carter stood near a large grill, turning racks of ribs while speaking with several guests. His wife Angela arranged trays of food on long folding tables covered with red and white cloths. Their teenage daughter helped younger children carry paper plates while their son unloaded bottled water from a cooler. Everything appeared organized. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet Linda could not shake the discomfort growing inside her. She had only moved into the neighborhood 8 months earlier. She did not know many people. She certainly did not know the Carters. What she knew was that every few minutes another vehicle seemed to arrive. Soon cars lined both sides of the street. Voices filled the air. Music played softly from speakers placed near the backyard patio. Linda watched through the window as a young boy accidentally dropped a bag of hamburger buns near the driveway. Before he could pick them up, James stepped over, helped him gather everything, and ruffled the child's hair with a smile. Nearby, Angela handed cold lemonade to an elderly woman who appeared tired from the heat. The woman smiled gratefully. Several children laughed as they chased bubbles, floating through the yard. It looked less like a disturbance and more like a celebration. Yet Linda continued watching. Her eyes narrowed every time another guest arrived. "How many people do they need?" she whispered. Across the street, James greeted each person as though welcoming family into his home. He remembered names. He carried supplies. He introduced guests to one another. More than once, neighbors walking by stopped to chat with him. The interaction seemed natural, familiar, comfortable. But Linda saw something else. She saw a crowd becoming larger than what she believed belonged in the neighborhood. As the afternoon progressed, the sound of laughter grew louder. Smoke rose from the grill into the bright blue sky. Children played basketball in a nearby driveway. Someone carried out another folding table. Linda finally stepped away from the window and reached for her phone. Her reflection stared back at her from the dark screen for a moment. Then she looked outside again. The Carters were smiling. Their guests were smiling. The entire street seemed alive with energy. Yet instead of seeing community, Linda saw a problem. Her finger hovered above the screen. "Someone needs to do something," she said quietly. Outside, the summer gathering continued beneath the warm glow of the setting sun, completely unaware that a single phone call was about to change the entire afternoon. The entire afternoon remained blissfully unaware that a decision had already been made behind a closed curtain. Linda Whitmore stood in her kitchen staring at her phone while the sounds of laughter drifted through the open window above the sink. Children cheered somewhere across the street. A burst of applause followed. Then came the unmistakable scent of barbecue smoke, mixed with summer grass and fresh lemonade. For a brief moment she hesitated. The gathering did not look dangerous. Nobody appeared intoxicated. Nobody was arguing. Yet the crowd continued growing. That fact alone seemed to bother her. She walked back to the front window and looked outside again. The Carter family moved through the event with practiced ease. James Carter stood beside the grill wearing a dark apron, carefully turning chicken and ribs while greeting guests arriving every few minutes. Angela Carter floated from table to table making certain everyone had enough food and water. Their daughter helped younger children decorate paper signs for a community game. Their son carried folding chairs to elderly guests before they could even ask. The entire scene felt organized, intentional, welcoming. Across the street, an elderly man slowly stepped from his vehicle carrying a cane. Before Linda could blink, James crossed the yard and helped him navigate the driveway. The older man smiled warmly and placed a hand on James's shoulder. They laughed about something Linda could not hear. A few minutes later, Angela guided the man toward a shaded chair beneath a large canopy. Nearby, several teenagers unloaded coolers from a truck. Instead of rushing toward food, they immediately began helping younger children set up games on the lawn. Linda frowned. None of it matched the image she had built in her mind. She looked toward the line of parked cars stretching farther down the block. There had to be more than 20 vehicles now. Some belonged to local residents. Others displayed county parking permits or small business logos on the doors. She noticed one truck from a landscaping company, another from a construction firm. A sedan bearing the logo of a local nonprofit organization arrived and parked near the corner. Guests stepped out carrying desserts. More greetings followed. More smiles. More hugs. What exactly is this? Linda muttered. She had never seen so many people gathered for a neighborhood barbecue. Across the street, a young girl accidentally spilled lemonade on the grass and immediately looked frightened. Angela knelt beside her, handed her a napkin, and whispered something that made the child laugh again. The girl ran off smiling. A few feet away, James handed paper plates to two police officers who had stopped by while off duty. They shook his hand and thanked him before joining a table near the backyard fence. Linda noticed that. It bothered her for reasons she could not fully explain. As the afternoon sunlight softened into a warmer golden hue, music floated through the neighborhood. Not loud, just enough to create a welcoming atmosphere. Several nearby residents who were not attending paused during evening walks to wave toward the gathering. Some were invited inside the yard. Others stopped briefly to chat before continuing home. The entire neighborhood seemed connected to the event in ways Linda did not understand. Yet instead of curiosity, she felt irritation. The crowd was larger now. The laughter seemed louder. The sense of belonging surrounding the Carter family felt impossible to ignore. Finally, Linda lowered herself into a chair beside the window and tightened her grip on the phone. Outside, James Carter raised a tray of food while guests applauded another arrival entering the yard. Linda took a slow breath, opened the emergency non-emergency contact list on her screen, and decided she had seen enough. The decision felt easier once Linda convinced herself she was protecting the neighborhood. She sat beside the window, listening to laughter drift across the street while her thumb hovered over the call button. The gathering had become the center of attention for nearly the entire block. Cars lined the curb. Children ran through the grass. Music floated softly through the evening air. Yet none of that mattered to her anymore. In her mind, the issue was simple. There were too many people. Too much activity. Too much noise. She pressed the button. A calm dispatcher answered. Linda immediately straightened in her chair. "I would like to report a large gathering in my neighborhood," she said. The dispatcher asked a few routine questions. Linda described the number of vehicles, the crowd, and the location. She carefully avoided mentioning that she had not witnessed any fighting, threats, or dangerous behavior. Instead, she focused on how unusual the event felt to her. The dispatcher thanked her and explained that officers would assess the situation if necessary. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. When it ended, Linda set her phone on the table and looked outside once more. Across the street, life continued without interruption. James Carter was carrying trays of food toward a group of guests seated beneath a large canopy. Angela Carter moved between tables, making certain everyone was comfortable. Several children laughed as they chased bubbles through the yard. An elderly woman rested comfortably in a shaded chair while speaking with neighbors. Nothing about the scene suggested trouble. Still, Linda folded her arms and waited. Minutes passed. The sun drifted lower in the sky. Warm orange light settled across rooftops and lawns. The smell of grilled food grew richer. More guests continued arriving. One family walked up carrying homemade desserts. Another arrived with folding tables. Every newcomer seemed genuinely happy to be there. What surprised Linda most was the way people greeted James and Angela. It was not casual. It was personal, familiar. Some guests embraced them immediately. Others shook hands and thanked them for something Linda could not hear. The reaction seemed unusually warm, almost grateful. Yet she dismissed the thought. Nearly 20 minutes later, she noticed movement near the corner of the street. A police vehicle slowly turned onto the block. Its lights remained off. The vehicle moved at a calm, deliberate pace before stopping several houses away. A second patrol unit followed behind it. Linda immediately stepped closer to the window. Her heartbeat quickened. Across the street, nobody seemed alarmed. The music continued. Children continued playing. James stood near the grill talking with several guests. Angela laughed at something one of the children said. The officers climbed out of their vehicles and looked toward the gathering. One of them appeared to study the scene for a moment before speaking quietly to his partner. Then they began walking toward the Carter home. Linda felt a small sense of satisfaction. Finally, someone else would see what she saw. Finally, someone would ask questions. Yet as the officers crossed the street, something unexpected happened. One of them slowed his pace. His expression changed. Even from her window, Linda could see it. Recognition. The officer looked directly at James Carter. James looked back. Then a smile appeared on James's face. Not the nervous smile of someone worried about police arriving. It was the relaxed smile of someone greeting an old friend. The officer smiled too. And in that single moment, before a single word was exchanged, Linda felt the first crack appear in the story she had spent all afternoon telling herself. For several seconds, Linda simply stared through the window. The reaction she expected never came. The officers were not walking with urgency. They were not scanning the crowd for problems. They were not preparing to shut anything down. Instead, they approached the gathering as though they had arrived at a neighborhood event they already understood. James Carter stepped away from the grill and met them near the edge of the driveway. The first officer extended his hand immediately. James shook it with a warm smile. Then the second officer did the same. Whatever conversation followed seemed relaxed enough that all three men laughed within moments. Across the yard, nobody appeared concerned by the police presence. In fact, several guests waved casually toward the officers. One of the children even ran over carrying a basketball and briefly showed it to one of them before racing back toward the driveway. Linda blinked. That was not how she expected this scene to unfold. She leaned closer to the glass. The officers remained near James, speaking comfortably while occasionally glancing toward the gathering. One accepted a bottle of water from Angela. Another shook hands with an elderly guest seated beneath the canopy. The entire interaction looked less like an investigation and more like neighbors catching up after a long week. Meanwhile, the celebration continued. Music drifted through the warm evening air. Plates of food moved between tables. Children laughed near the lawn games. The smell of barbecue seemed even stronger now as sunlight painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Then something else caught Linda's attention. A black SUV slowly pulled onto the street and parked near the Carter home. A well-dressed woman stepped out carrying a covered tray. Several guests immediately greeted her. James walked over personally to welcome her. Moments later, another vehicle arrived. Then another. Linda watched as newcomers entered the gathering with remarkable familiarity. They were not strangers showing up to a random party. They seemed connected, purposefully connected. Every arrival was greeted by name. Every person appeared genuinely happy to be there. Across the street, the officers eventually accepted paper plates and moved toward one of the tables. Linda frowned. "Why are they staying?" she whispered. Her confusion deepened as she continued observing. A man in business attire arrived carrying what looked like several large dessert boxes. Another guest wore a polo shirt embroidered with the logo of a local construction company. A woman carrying educational materials was welcomed enthusiastically by both Angela and several teenagers. The gathering seemed increasingly diverse. Business owners, families, retirees, teachers, children, professionals. Somehow they all knew the Carters. The realization made Linda uncomfortable. She had lived on the same street for months, yet she barely knew any of these people. Across the yard, Angela noticed a little girl struggling to carry a heavy tray of drinks. She immediately stepped forward and helped her. Nearby, James adjusted an elderly guest's chair so it would remain in the shade as temperatures slowly cooled. Small acts, simple gestures, yet they happened constantly. As the evening progressed, Linda noticed that people did not merely enjoy being around the Carter family. They trusted them, respected them, looked to them naturally. It was visible in every conversation, every greeting, every smile. The officers finally finished their meals and spoke with James one last time before preparing to leave. As they walked back toward their patrol vehicles, one of them turned around and waved. James waved back. The officer's expression carried unmistakable respect. Linda felt another crack appear in her assumptions. Whatever she thought she knew about the family across the street, the evidence gathering before her eyes suggested a very different story. And for the first time all afternoon, curiosity began replacing certainty. Linda remained near the window long after the police vehicles disappeared from sight. The certainty she had carried throughout the afternoon was fading, replaced by a growing sense of confusion. Nothing had unfolded the way she expected. The gathering had not been disrupted. No warnings had been issued. No complaints had been discussed. Instead, the officers had shared food, exchanged handshakes, and left smiling. Across the street, the celebration continued as though the visit had been nothing more than a brief stop between friends. The evening sky deepened into shades of orange and gold. String lights hanging across the Carter backyard began to glow softly. Their warm light reflected off tables covered with food and drinks. Guests gathered in small groups, talking and laughing. Children chased one another across the lawn while older residents relaxed beneath the canopy. It felt less like a party and more like a reunion. Linda noticed something else. The guests were not remaining in isolated groups. Business owners sat beside retirees. Teenagers spoke comfortably with community leaders. Young families shared tables with elderly couples. Everyone seemed connected by something larger than friendship. She watched James move through the crowd. Every few steps, someone stopped him to shake his hand. Several guests thanked him for things Linda could not hear. Others simply smiled when he approached. The respect people showed him seemed effortless. Nobody appeared obligated. It felt genuine. Then a luxury sedan slowly pulled onto the street. Linda immediately noticed it because it stood out among the other vehicles. The driver stepped out wearing a tailored suit despite the summer heat. He carried a small gift bag and walked directly toward James. Before James could say a word, the man embraced him warmly. Several nearby guests applauded. Linda narrowed her eyes. Moments later, another vehicle arrived. Then another. One passenger wore a jacket displaying the logo of a regional hospital. Another appeared to be a school administrator. A woman carrying educational pamphlets was greeted by several teenagers who seemed excited to see her. Every new arrival only deepened the mystery. Linda found herself watching less out of suspicion and more out of curiosity. Across the yard, Angela stood beside a long table helping several children assemble care packages. Small boxes were being filled with school supplies, snacks, notebooks, and handwritten encouragement cards. The children worked enthusiastically while Angela guided them with patience and warmth. Nearby, James helped load several larger boxes into the back of a volunteer's truck. This was not part of a typical backyard barbecue. Linda leaned forward. She could now see labels on some of the boxes. School supply drive. Community outreach. Youth scholarship program. Her eyes widened slightly. A few minutes later, one of the teenagers approached James holding a framed photograph. Several guests gathered around. The young man spoke for a moment before handing the frame to him. Even from across the street, Linda could see the emotion on the teenager's face. James listened quietly before placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. Applause spread through the gathering. Angela smiled while wiping a small tear from her eye. The moment felt deeply personal, meaningful. Linda suddenly realized that almost every interaction she had witnessed throughout the evening involved gratitude. People were not simply attending because they enjoyed free food. They were there because the Carter family had somehow touched their lives. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She looked again at the crowd filling the yard. Earlier she had seen strangers. Now she saw teachers, volunteers, parents, students, business owners, and neighbors. More importantly, she saw something she had missed all afternoon. The gathering was not drawing strength from the event itself. The event was drawing strength from the people whose lives had already been changed by the family hosting it. And for the first time since the barbecue began, Linda found herself wondering not who the Carters were, but how many lives they had quietly helped before she ever moved onto the street. As darkness slowly approached, the atmosphere across the street became even warmer. Soft string lights glowed above the backyard, casting golden reflections across smiling faces and folding tables filled with food. The evening breeze carried the scent of barbecue, fresh lemonade, and summer grass through the neighborhood. Linda remained near her window, unable to pull herself away. What had begun as suspicion had slowly transformed into fascination. She still did not fully understand who the Carter family was, but she was beginning to understand how people felt about them. Every passing minute seemed to reveal another piece of the puzzle. Across the yard, Angela Carter continued moving from group to group, making certain everyone felt welcome. She noticed when someone needed a chair. She noticed when a child seemed shy. She noticed when an elderly guest's drink needed refilling. Nothing appeared forced. Her kindness flowed naturally, as though taking care of people had become second nature years ago. Near one of the tables, a young mother balanced a toddler on her hip while speaking with Angela. After a few moments, the woman unexpectedly hugged her. Angela hugged her back. The young mother appeared emotional. Linda could not hear the conversation, but the gratitude on the woman's face was unmistakable. Nearby, James stood speaking with several men and women who appeared to be local business owners. They listened attentively as he spoke. More than once, someone laughed and shook his hand. The interactions carried a level of respect that extended far beyond ordinary friendship. Then another moment caught Linda's attention. A teenage girl approached Angela carrying a small envelope. Angela looked surprised. The girl handed it to her with a nervous smile. Angela opened it carefully. Inside appeared to be a handwritten letter. As she read, her expression softened. She placed a hand over her heart and hugged the teenager. Several people nearby smiled knowingly. Linda found herself leaning closer to the glass. What was in that letter? Why did it seem to matter so much? Across the yard, the answer arrived unexpectedly. The teenager joined a group of friends and began speaking excitedly. Although Linda could not hear every word, fragments occasionally carried through the evening air. Scholarship, college, application, support. The pieces slowly connected. The young woman had likely received help from the Carter family. Not just encouragement, real help, meaningful help. The realization lingered in Linda's mind. A few minutes later, another conversation revealed even more. Near the driveway, an older man spoke with several guests while pointing toward James. One sentence drifted clearly across the quiet street. Without him, our store would not have survived. The listeners nodded immediately. Another person added something about jobs. Someone else mentioned a difficult year during the economic downturn. Linda frowned thoughtfully. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Everywhere she looked, people seemed to be sharing stories about opportunities, support, mentorship, or assistance connected to the Carter family. Yet James and Angela never appeared interested in recognition. They continued serving food, checking on guests, and helping children with games as though they were simply hosts at a backyard gathering. The humility struck Linda almost as much as the gratitude surrounding them. Then came perhaps the most surprising moment of the evening. Several teenagers gathered near a portable microphone positioned beside the patio. One by one, they began thanking volunteers who had helped with various community projects throughout the year. Teachers received applause. Coaches received applause. Local mentors received applause. When James and Angela were mentioned, the reaction was different. The entire yard stood. The applause lasted longer. The smiles grew wider. Some guests even wiped away tears. Linda stood perfectly still. She had spent the entire afternoon looking for reasons to question this family. Yet every new detail pointed in the opposite direction. Whatever the Carters had built, it extended far beyond their property line. And as the evening deepened beneath the glow of the string lights, Linda began realizing that she knew almost nothing about the people she had judged so quickly. The applause gradually faded, but the feeling it left behind lingered in the warm evening air. Linda remained frozen beside her window, staring across the street as guests settled back into conversations and laughter. The scene looked completely different now than it had only a few hours earlier. Nothing in the yard had changed. The same string lights glowed above the tables. The same music drifted softly from the speakers. The same children ran through the grass chasing one another beneath the fading sky. Yet everything felt different because she was finally seeing it through a different lens. Earlier, she had viewed the gathering as an intrusion. Now she was beginning to see it as something rare. A community held together by genuine relationships. Across the yard, James Carter moved from table to table checking on guests. He stopped to speak with a retired teacher. A few minutes later, he helped carry supplies toward one of the outreach stations near the patio. Everywhere he went, people welcomed him warmly. No one seemed impressed by wealth or status. Instead, they seemed grateful for something much deeper. Nearby, Angela sat beside a group of high school students gathered around one of the folding tables. They listened carefully as she spoke. Several took notes on small pads of paper. Linda could not hear the conversation, but she noticed the way the students looked at her. It was not casual attention. It was admiration, respect, the kind usually reserved for someone who had invested time in their lives. A soft knock suddenly interrupted Linda's thoughts. She stepped away from the window and opened her front door. Standing outside was Harold Jensen, an elderly neighbor who lived 3 houses away. "Evening, Linda," he said with a friendly smile. "Beautiful night." Linda nodded. "It certainly is." Harold glanced toward the Carter home. "Looks like another wonderful turnout." Linda hesitated. "Another?" Harold looked surprised. "You have not seen one of these before?" She shook her head. "No." The older man smiled. "James and Angela have hosted community gatherings for years. People look forward to them." Linda felt a slight knot form in her stomach. "They do." Harold laughed softly. "Of course. Half the neighborhood has a story about those two." He leaned against the porch railing. "When my wife got sick a few years ago, James organized volunteers to help maintain our yard for 6 months. Never asked for recognition. Just showed up every weekend." Linda blinked. Harold continued. "And Angela helped my granddaughter prepare college applications. Spent hours with her. That scholarship she earned changed everything." He glanced toward the gathering again. "You would be amazed how many stories like that exist." For a moment neither spoke. Across the street, more laughter drifted through the darkness. Harold eventually excused himself and continued his evening walk. Linda closed the door slowly. Then she returned to the window. The knot in her stomach had grown larger. Not because she had learned something negative. Quite the opposite. Every new piece of information made her earlier assumptions harder to justify. As she watched, another guest approached James and handed him an envelope. They spoke briefly before sharing a warm handshake. Nearby, Angela embraced an elderly woman who appeared deeply emotional. Children continued playing beneath the lights while volunteers organized boxes destined for local families in need. It no longer resembled a simple barbecue. It looked like the beating heart of an entire community. And for the first time since she had moved into the neighborhood, Linda began wondering whether the problem she thought she saw across the street had never existed at all. The realization stayed with Linda long after Harold disappeared down the sidewalk. She remained near the window, watching the celebration continue beneath the soft glow of string lights and the deepening colors of the evening sky. The sounds drifting across the street no longer felt disruptive. They felt alive, warm, human. Yet the more she learned, the more uncomfortable she became. Not because of anything the Carter family had done, but because of how quickly she had judged them before knowing anything at all. Across the yard, a small crowd had gathered near the patio where several volunteers were organizing supplies. Tables that earlier held food now displayed folders, brochures, donation forms, and community resource information. It looked less like a backyard event and more like a neighborhood support center disguised as a barbecue. Linda watched as a middle-aged woman approached one of the tables carrying a stack of papers. A volunteer greeted her enthusiastically and introduced her to Angela. Moments later, several people began discussing housing assistance programs and local outreach initiatives. Nearby, another group talked about scholarships and mentorship opportunities for students preparing for college. The conversations carried an energy that was impossible to fake. People were not simply socializing. They were helping one another. Then another unexpected moment unfolded. A young man in his early 20s stepped onto the patio holding a microphone. The music faded. Conversations gradually quieted. Guests turned toward him. James and Angela stood near the front, smiling encouragingly. The young man took a deep breath. Even from across the street, Linda could see his nerves. "A few years ago," he began, his voice carrying through the evening air, "I was not sure I would graduate high school." The crowd listened attentively. He continued speaking about difficult circumstances, financial challenges, and uncertainty about his future. Then he pointed toward James and Angela. "These two people never stopped believing in me." Applause erupted immediately. The young man smiled. He spoke about tutoring programs, mentorship, scholarship support, and countless conversations that helped him stay focused when quitting seemed easier. Several guests wiped away tears as he spoke. When he finished, the applause lasted even longer than before. Linda felt her chest tighten. She looked at James. He seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. Rather than step forward to accept praise, he simply shook the young man's hand and encouraged everyone to applaud for him instead. The humility was striking. A few minutes later, another woman shared a story about receiving assistance during a difficult period after losing her job. Then an elderly man described how volunteers connected through the Carter family had helped maintain his property during a medical recovery. Story after story followed. Different people, different backgrounds, different challenges. Yet every story led back to the same place. Opportunity, support, encouragement, community. Linda slowly sat down in the chair. Beside her window, the assumptions she had made earlier now felt increasingly difficult to defend. She remembered the irritation she felt when cars first arrived, the certainty she carried while making the phone call, the confidence with which she had decided that something was wrong. Looking back, she realized she had never once asked a simple question. Who are they? Instead, she had assumed she already knew the answer. Across the street, the gathering continued beneath the evening sky. Laughter returned. Music resumed. Children raced through the grass. Volunteers packed boxes destined for families in need. And standing quietly at the center of it all were James and Angela Carter, two people who seemed determined to improve the lives of everyone around them without asking for recognition in return. Linda looked away from the window for a moment and stared at the floor. Then she looked back toward the gathering. For the first time all day, she no longer felt like an observer watching strangers. She felt like someone standing outside a story she should have taken the time to understand from the beginning. The evening had reached that beautiful moment when daylight and darkness seemed to share the sky together. The last traces of orange sunlight lingered above the rooftops while the string lights in the Carter backyard glowed brighter with every passing minute. From her window, Linda continued watching the gathering, but now her attention had shifted completely. She was no longer searching for problems. She was searching for answers. Across the yard, guests moved comfortably between tables, conversations, and community projects. The atmosphere carried a sense of purpose that extended far beyond a simple neighborhood event. Then a sudden wave of excitement rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward the street. Conversations paused. Several guests smiled as a black SUV slowly pulled up beside the curb. The vehicle itself was unremarkable, but the reaction it created immediately caught Linda's attention. James and Angela exchanged a glance before walking toward the driveway. More people began gathering near the entrance of the yard. Curious, Linda leaned closer. To the glass. The passenger door opened. A distinguished woman stepped out wearing a professional blazer despite the summer evening. She was greeted warmly by several attendees before James reached her. The two shared a brief embrace. Then another round of applause spread through the crowd. Linda frowned thoughtfully. She had never seen this woman before, yet many people clearly recognized her. A few minutes later, another guest arrived carrying several folders. Then another arrived wearing a jacket embroidered with the seal of a local educational foundation. Conversations around the yard gradually shifted. The words scholarship, mentorship, community center, and youth program floated through the air often enough for Linda to hear them clearly. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. Whatever the Carter family had built, it stretched far beyond this neighborhood. Across the patio, one of the guests eventually stepped forward holding a microphone. Before we continue, he announced, we want to recognize something important. The crowd quieted. Linda found herself listening carefully. The speaker smiled toward James and Angela. Many people know about the scholarships. Many people know about the food drives. Many people know about the business grants and community projects. Several guests nodded. But not everyone knows how much of this community exists, because these two people decided years ago that success should be shared. The crowd erupted into applause once again. Linda felt a strange sensation in her chest. The speaker continued. He described programs supporting local students, initiatives helping small businesses survive difficult economic periods, volunteer projects that restored parks and public spaces, community outreach efforts that connected families with resources during emergencies. Story after story revealed contributions that touched nearly every corner of the city. Then came the moment that changed everything. A woman standing near the microphone smiled and pointed toward a stack of brochures resting on one of the tables. Most people use the community center every week without realizing who funded its construction. Several guests laughed knowingly. The same is true for the Youth Leadership Program, the Scholarship Foundation, and the Neighborhood Resource Network. Linda stared across the street. Community Center, Scholarship Foundation, Resource Network. These were not small projects. They were major parts of local life. She had passed the community center dozens of times since moving there. She remembered seeing students participate in scholarship events. She had even attended a local festival organized through one of the outreach programs. Yet she had never once asked who made those things possible. Across the yard, James looked visibly uncomfortable with the attention. He quietly thanked the speaker before trying to redirect focus back toward the volunteers and community members. The humility only made the revelation more powerful. Linda slowly sat down beside the window. The answer she had been searching for all evening was finally becoming clear. The gathering was not important because of how many people attended. It was important because those people represented lives connected by a family whose influence reached throughout the entire community. And for the first time, Linda began to understand that the neighborhood she thought she knew had been quietly shaped by the very people she had chosen to fear. By now the night had fully settled over the neighborhood. The sky above the rooftops had turned a deep navy blue, and the glow from the Carter backyard seemed almost magical against the darkness. String lights stretched from tree to tree. Lanterns illuminated the tables. Soft music drifted through the warm air while conversations blended into a gentle hum of laughter and friendship. Linda sat quietly near her window, no longer standing guard like she had earlier in the afternoon. The suspicion that once filled her thoughts had been replaced by something far more uncomfortable: reflection. Across the street, the gathering continued with an energy that seemed impossible to manufacture. Every person there appeared connected not by obligation but by genuine appreciation. Then another vehicle arrived. This time the reaction was immediate. Guests turned toward the street. Several people smiled. A few even began clapping before the passenger had fully stepped out. Linda leaned forward. The newcomer was a familiar face. She had seen him on local television broadcasts countless times. It was the mayor. For a moment she wondered if she was mistaken. But as the man walked through the gate and warmly greeted James and Angela, there could be no doubt. The mayor embraced both of them before joining the crowd. The sight alone stunned Linda. She watched as several guests welcomed him not as a celebrity but as another member of the community. A few minutes later, someone handed him a microphone. The conversations gradually softened. The crowd gathered closer. James immediately looked uncomfortable, as though he already suspected what was coming. The mayor smiled. "I know James is going to hate this," he joked, causing laughter to ripple through the audience. "But there are some things that deserve to be said out loud." The crowd applauded. Linda listened carefully. The mayor spoke about the growth of local businesses. He spoke about educational opportunities. He spoke about community programs that had helped hundreds of families over the years. Again and again, his words returned to the same people standing quietly near the center of the gathering: James and Angela. Yet what surprised Linda most was not the praise itself. It was the scale. Projects she had assumed belonged to government agencies. Programs she believed were funded by large organizations. Resources she thought simply appeared through public initiatives. One after another, the mayor explained how the Carter family had helped launch, support, or sustain them. Some efforts involved financial support. Others involved mentorship, volunteer coordination, or years of behind-the-scenes leadership. The list seemed endless. Linda slowly lowered herself into her chair. The community center. The scholarship fund. youth mentorship programs, small business assistance initiatives, food outreach networks. She had spent months benefiting from a neighborhood shaped by their work without ever realizing who helped make it possible. Across the yard, James finally accepted the microphone. The crowd quieted. "None of this belongs to us," he said simply. "Everything we have accomplished happened because people chose to help each other." The applause that followed felt different from earlier. It was not admiration for success. It was appreciation for character. James quickly returned the microphone and encouraged everyone to recognize the volunteers instead. The crowd responded with another standing ovation. Linda stared through the glass, her reflection faintly visible against the dark window. Earlier that day she had looked at the gathering and seen strangers who did not belong. Now she understood the truth. The people across the street were not outsiders occupying the neighborhood. They were among the very people who had helped build it. And as the applause echoed beneath the string lights, Linda realized the greatest mistake of the evening had not been the phone call. It had been believing she understood someone before taking the time to know them. The applause slowly faded into the night, but Linda remained seated beside the window long after everyone else returned to their conversations. The mayor's words continued echoing through her mind. She had spent an entire afternoon building assumptions about people she had never spoken to. Now every assumption lay shattered beneath the weight of reality. Across the street, the gathering had settled into a quieter rhythm. Guests shared desserts. Children chased fireflies near the edge of the lawn. Volunteers organized the final outreach materials while soft music drifted beneath the glow of string lights. The atmosphere felt peaceful, comfortable, familiar. Linda watched James helping stack chairs while Angela checked on several elderly guests before they left for the evening. Despite everything she had learned, neither of them behaved like people seeking attention. They moved through the crowd exactly as they had all day, focused entirely on others. A sudden feeling of embarrassment settled heavily in her chest. She looked down at her hands. The same hands that had held the phone only hours earlier. The same hands that had dialed the number. At the time she had been convinced she was doing the right thing. Now she could barely understand the certainty she once felt. Her thoughts were interrupted by another knock at the door. This time it was Melissa Harper, a neighbor who lived at the end of the block. "I was heading home and saw your light on," Melissa said with a smile. "Everything okay?" Linda hesitated before nodding. "I think so." Melissa followed her gaze toward the Carter home and laughed softly. "Quite a night, huh?" Linda managed a small smile. "I had no idea they were involved in so much." Melissa looked genuinely surprised. "You did not know?" Linda shook her head. Melissa stepped inside for a moment and glanced across the street. "James helped my brother start his business after he lost his job. Angela mentored my daughter all through high school. Honestly, I cannot imagine this neighborhood without them." Linda swallowed hard. "Everyone seems to have a story." Melissa nodded. "That is because everyone does." The words lingered after Melissa left. "Everyone does." Linda returned to the window and stared at the gathering. For the first time, she stopped focusing on what the Carter family had accomplished and started thinking about why it affected her so deeply. The answer was uncomfortable. She realized she had decided who they were before learning a single fact about them. Their guests, their success, their gathering, even their presence in the neighborhood. She had filtered everything through assumptions she never bothered to question. Across the street, James noticed a volunteer struggling with several heavy boxes and immediately walked over to help. Angela wrapped leftover food containers for guests preparing to leave. Nearby, a teenager thanked them both before heading toward a waiting vehicle. Small moments. Ordinary moments. Yet somehow they felt more powerful than the speeches, because they revealed who the Carters were when nobody expected recognition. Linda felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She could no longer pretend the problem had been noise or traffic or parked cars. The real problem had been her willingness to judge before understanding. The realization hurt because it was true. Outside, laughter rose one more time from the gathering before, slowly fading into the warm summer night. Linda remained by the window, watching the family she had misunderstood all day. And as she sat alone in the quiet of her living room, she finally reached a conclusion she could no longer avoid. Tomorrow she needed to cross the street. The next morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt completely different from the energy of the night before. Sunlight spilled across the neighborhood lawns. Birds moved between tree branches. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically in the distance. Yet Linda Whitmore barely noticed any of it. She stood in her kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her eyes remained fixed on the house across the street. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, she felt nervous about meeting the people who lived there. The feeling surprised her. After all, James and Angela Carter had done nothing to make her uncomfortable. The discomfort came entirely from within. It came from knowing she had judged them unfairly. It came from remembering the phone call. It came from understanding that they had spent an entire afternoon showing kindness to everyone around them, while she sat behind a curtain making assumptions. Around mid-morning, she finally took a deep breath and stepped outside. The summer air felt warm against her skin as she crossed the street. Each step seemed heavier than the last. Across the yard, James was helping unload supplies from a volunteer truck. Angela stood nearby organizing boxes filled with educational materials and community resources left over from the event. Even after hosting hundreds of guests the night before, they were already back to helping others. Linda almost turned around. Then James looked up and noticed her approaching. His expression immediately brightened. "Good morning," he called warmly. The simple kindness in his voice made her feel even worse. Angela smiled as well. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Linda stopped near the edge of the driveway. For a moment, she could not find the words. Everything she had rehearsed inside her house suddenly disappeared. James waited patiently. Angela did the same. Neither seemed rushed. Neither seemed suspicious. Finally, Linda took a breath. "I owe both of you an apology." The yard became very quiet. James set down the box he was carrying. Angela stepped closer. Linda looked down briefly before forcing herself to continue. "Yesterday, I made assumptions about your family. Assumptions that were unfair. I saw the gathering and convinced myself I knew what was happening without taking the time to learn the truth." She swallowed hard. "I was the person who called the police." For several seconds nobody spoke. Linda felt her heart pounding. Then something unexpected happened. James smiled gently. Not a smile of amusement. Not a smile of victory. Simply a smile filled with understanding. Angela stepped forward and rested a hand lightly against her arm. "Thank you for being honest," she said softly. Linda looked up surprised. She had expected disappointment, perhaps even anger. Instead, she found compassion. James nodded. Most people would not have crossed the street to say that. The kindness in his response nearly brought tears to her eyes. "I was wrong," Linda admitted. "And after everything I learned last night, I felt terrible." James glanced toward the neighborhood around them. "We all get things wrong sometimes." Angela smiled. "What matters is what we choose to do after that." The simplicity of the answer struck Linda harder than any criticism could have. There was no lecture. No judgment. No attempt to embarrass her. Only grace. Then James pointed toward several empty chairs arranged near the patio. "We are having a volunteer planning meeting in a few minutes. You are welcome to join us if you would like." Linda blinked. "After everything?" Angela laughed softly. "Especially after everything." For the first time since beginning her walk across the street, Linda smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that comes when a burden finally begins to lift. She looked around at the yard that had caused so much misunderstanding only a day earlier. Now she saw it clearly. Not as a place she feared. Not as a place she questioned. But as a place where people were welcomed. And as she accepted the invitation and followed James and Angela toward the patio, she realized something remarkable. The community she thought she was protecting had already been protecting something far more valuable all along. The simple belief that people deserved the chance to be known before they were judged. Over the weeks that followed, something quietly changed on the street. It was not a dramatic transformation that happened overnight. There were no speeches, no public announcements, no grand gestures. Instead, the change appeared in small moments that gradually connected together like pieces of a larger picture. Linda began attending volunteer meetings at the Carter home. First, she mostly listened. She sat near the back of the patio while community members discussed scholarship programs, food drives, neighborhood improvement projects, and outreach efforts for local families. She expected to feel out of place. Instead, she found herself welcomed with the same kindness everyone else received. Nobody treated her as the woman who had called the police. Nobody reminded her of her mistake. James and Angela never mentioned it again. They simply gave her the opportunity to become part of something positive. One Saturday morning, Linda helped distribute school supplies to students preparing for a new academic year. Another week, she joined volunteers planting flowers near the community center she had learned the Carter family helped create years earlier. As the months passed, she met people whose lives had been touched by their generosity. Teachers, small business owners, college students, retirees, single parents. Every conversation revealed another story. Every story revealed another reason why the community respected the Carter family so deeply. Yet what impressed Linda most was not their success. It was their consistency. Whether they were speaking with the mayor or helping a child carry a backpack, they treated people with the same warmth and dignity. One evening near the end of summer, the neighborhood gathered once again for the annual barbecue. This time Linda arrived carrying 2 homemade pies. Children raced through the grass. Music floated through the air. String lights glowed beneath the fading sunset. The familiar scent of barbecue drifted across the lawn. As guests filled the yard, Linda looked around and smiled. The scene felt different now because she was no longer watching from behind a window. She was part of it. Near the patio, James laughed with several volunteers while Angela helped organize food for arriving families. The same kindness that had touched so many lives remained unchanged. Later that evening, as the sky turned gold and purple above the neighborhood, Linda found herself sitting beside Angela beneath the string lights. They watched children playing together near the edge of the lawn. "This is a wonderful community," Linda said quietly. Angela smiled. "It really is." Linda looked around at the people talking, laughing, and helping one another. "I almost missed all of this." Angela glanced toward her. "What matters is that you did not." The words stayed with Linda as the evening continued. Eventually the sun slipped below the horizon. Lanterns illuminated the tables. Conversations softened. Families began saying their goodbyes. One by one, vehicles pulled away from the curb. The neighborhood slowly settled into peaceful silence. Before leaving, Linda paused at the edge of the Carter driveway and looked back toward the gathering. Months earlier, she had stood in her living room convinced that the people across the street did not belong. Now she understood a truth far greater than anything she had imagined. The Carter family had never needed to prove their place in the community. Through years of kindness, service, and compassion, they had helped create it. And as the final lights glowed softly beneath the summer night sky, Linda smiled, grateful that one family's grace had taught her something she would never forget. People are not defined by assumptions, but by the character they show when given the chance to be known.